The rain had just started to fall when I pulled into the long gravel driveway. The sound of tires crunching against stone mixing with the steady drumming of droplets on the windshield. The house loomed at the end of the drive, its windows glowing with warm light, mocking me like a cruel reminder of everything I had built and everything they thought they could take from me. That house wasn't just a collection of bricks and beams. It was my father's legacy, my mother's dreams, and the place I had poured my blood, sweat, and soul into preserving. Yet, tonight, as I stepped out of the car, umbrella in hand, I knew I wasn't welcome. Not by them. Not anymore. I had barely walked up the porch steps when the door swung open. 3 figures stood there, their faces hard, eyes filled with disdain. My cousin Harold, his wife Denise, and their spoiled daughter Tiffany. The people who had once smiled at family gatherings, who had laughed at my jokes, now looked at me as if I were a stranger trespassing on their sacred ground. Harold's voice cut through the storm, sharp and merciless. "You don't belong here anymore." The words hit harder than the rain. Denise crossed her arms, her lips curling into a smug little smile. Tiffany tilted her head, phone in hand, recording as though this was nothing more than entertainment for her social feed. I felt my stomach twist, but I refused to show weakness. I stood taller, gripping the umbrella as though it could anchor me against the weight of their rejection. "Is that so?" I asked, my voice calm, though every nerve in me trembled. "Yes." Harold snapped. "This house isn't yours. You've been gone too long. Things have changed. You can't just waltz back here like you own the place." For a moment, I simply stared at them, rain dripping from my coat onto the wooden porch. My heart pounded in my ears, every beat echoing with anger I had buried for years. They thought I had no claim, no rights. They thought I was powerless, a ghost of the past trying to cling to what was already lost. But they had forgotten one thing. One very important thing. I smiled, slow and deliberate. The kind of smile that made Harold shift uncomfortably, though he tried to hide it. "You seem to have forgotten whose name is on the deed." The silence that followed was thick. Denise's smirk faltered. Tiffany lowered her phone just slightly, and Harold's jaw clenched so tightly I could almost hear his teeth grind. They weren't expecting that. They thought I came back begging, desperate for scraps of acceptance. But I wasn't here to beg. I was here to claim what was rightfully mine. The rain grew heavier, wind howling through the trees, as if the storm itself sided with me. I stepped past them. My shoes thudding against the hardwood floor I remembered polishing with my mother as a child. The familiar scent of cedar and faint lavender filled my nose, dragging me back to memories of laughter, holiday dinners, and whispered stories by the fireplace. This house was alive with my past, not theirs. "Get out," Harold barked, grabbing my arm roughly. But I twisted free, my eyes locking onto his with a fire I hadn't felt in years. "Don't touch me," I warned, my voice steady. "You've taken enough already," Tiffany scoffed. "You sound so dramatic. Nobody cares about your old stories. This house is ours now." I turned to her, my expression cold. "Yours? Really? Did you bleed for it? Did you work double shifts to keep the roof from collapsing? Did you sit by my father's hospital bed, promising him you'd protect his legacy? No, Tiffany. You've done nothing but leech off what doesn't belong to you." Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she quickly masked it with an eye roll. Harold stepped between us, his chest puffed like a guard dog. I said, "You don't belong here. Leave before we make you." And there it was, the challenge, the ultimatum. They thought they could erase me, erase everything I had done, with a few cruel words. But they had underestimated the depth of my resolve. I let out a low laugh, shaking my head. "You can try to push me out, Harold. You can try to erase me. But this house knows my footsteps. These walls remember my voice. And the papers, those legal, binding papers, they remember my name. You forgot that, didn't you?" Denise shifted nervously now, glancing at Harold as if silently asking if what I said was true. I caught it, and I relished the doubt creeping into their minds. The storm outside rattled the windows, and the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across their faces. "Mark my words," I said, my tone low, almost like a vow. "This is far from over. You think you've won because you've filled the house with your laughter, your things, your arrogance. But you've built your comfort on stolen ground. And sooner or later, stolen ground always collapses." I brushed past them, deeper into the house, my hand trailing along the banister polished smooth by years of use. My heart thudded with a mix of pain and determination. I could feel their eyes burning holes into my back, but I didn't care. Let them watch. Let them realize too late that I wasn't someone they could just push aside. Because revenge had already begun to stir in me like a storm waiting to break. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. I sat at the old kitchen table, the same one where my mother used to set out steaming plates of cornbread and stew, The same table where my father once slapped his hand down and said, "This house will never leave our bloodline." The irony wasn't lost on me. Outside, I could hear Harold's laugh booming across the yard as he barked orders at a crew of contractors. They were tearing down the old barn, the one my grandfather built with his bare hands. I clenched my fists so tightly my knuckles turned white. That barn wasn't just wood and nails, it was history, sweat, and memory. But Harold didn't see that. He saw land, property value, resale numbers. He saw my family's roots as nothing more than dead weight to be cleared out for profit. Denise walked into the kitchen, heels clicking against the floor. She looked at me with narrowed eyes, lips pursed as though I were a stain she couldn't scrub out. "You're still here," she said flatly. I didn't look up from the coffee cup I held. "Of course I'm still here. My name's still on the deed." Her smirk returned, cruel and mocking. "Maybe for now. But people like you're always too weak to fight for what you think belongs to you. You've been gone for years. You don't even know what this place needs anymore." I finally looked at her, letting the silence stretch before speaking. "What it needs is respect. Something you wouldn't understand." Her eyes flashed with irritation, but before she could reply, Tiffany's shrill voice echoed from the hallway. "Mom! Dad wants you outside." Denise gave me one last sneer before strutting out. Left alone, I let out a long breath, running my fingers along the grooves in the table where I had once carved my initials as a boy. They wanted me gone, erased, forgotten. But every corner of this house whispered otherwise. I could almost hear my father's voice. "Don't let them take it from you." That night, after the contractors left and the house grew quiet, I slipped into the study. The room smelled of leather and old books, just as it always had. Behind the desk was a safe, one only I knew how to open. My father had shown me when I was 16, telling me that one day it might matter. My hands trembled as I spun the dial, each click echoing louder than the last. When it opened, I pulled out the stack of papers neatly bound with a ribbon. The deed, the will, my father's words in ink, declaring me the rightful owner of the estate. Not Harold, not Denise. Certainly not Tiffany. Me. I spread the documents across the desk, my chest tightening as the weight of responsibility settled in. My father had trusted me. He had counted on me. And I had left for too long, letting the vultures circle and claim what wasn't theirs. But no more. The next morning, I walked into the living room where Harold lounged in my father's old armchair, sipping whiskey as though he owned the place. "We need to talk," I said, holding the papers in my hand. He glanced up, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Still here? I thought you'd have crawled back to whatever hole you came from by now." I ignored his jab, laying the deed on the coffee table in front of him. His smug grin faltered as his eyes scanned the document. Denise, perched beside him, leaned forward, her face paling. Tiffany peeked over the back of the couch, her phone poised to record, but for once, she didn't look so confident. "This house is mine," I said firmly. "It always has been. My father left it to me, and no amount of lies, threats, or cheap contractors will change that." Harold's jaw tightened. "You think a piece of paper is enough to scare me? You think you can just walk in after years of abandonment and play hero?" I leaned closer, my voice low and steady. "I don't need to play hero. I just need to remind you of reality. And the reality is you've been living on borrowed ground." For a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Then Denise snapped, her voice shrill. "We've made this place better. We've modernized it, we've invested in it. What have you done? Nothing? You don't deserve it." My chest burned, but I didn't waver. "Better. You're tearing down history. You're destroying the heart of this place because you don't understand it. And that's why you'll never truly own it. Because it doesn't belong to you." Harold slammed his glass down, whiskey splashing across the table. "Get out before I throw you out myself." I stood tall, gathering the papers. "No, Harold, I'm not leaving. Not this time. You wanted a fight. You've got one." As I walked away, I could feel their rage boiling behind me. But beneath their fury, I saw something else flicker across their faces. Doubt, fear, they weren't invincible anymore. And that was exactly how revenge begins. Quiet, steady, like the first crack in a dam before the flood. The days that followed were tense, every hallway thick with unspoken words, every meal poisoned by the weight of glares. Harold and Denise carried themselves with false confidence, strutting around the house like peacocks. But I could see the unease simmering just beneath their bravado. Tiffany, on the other hand, became bolder, parading her entitlement with careless arrogance. She filmed herself in nearly every room of the house, flaunting the property as if it were a backdrop for her shallow social media fame. One evening, I found her in the dining room, standing on one of my mother's antique chairs to get the perfect shot. The sight made my stomach twist with rage. Get down, I said, my tone sharp. She barely spared me a glance. You're not the boss of me. I stepped closer, my voice colder. Get down before you break something that's worth more than every pair of shoes you own. She huffed dramatically but climbed down, muttering under her breath. You're so pathetic. No wonder nobody wanted you here. I ignored the sting of her words, but inside I filed them away. Each insult, each slight, was fuel. They thought I was weak, an outsider. But they had no idea how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine. That night, as the house settled into silence, I retreated to the study again. I spread the documents across the desk and began making calls. The lawyer who had overseen my father's will still worked in town, and when he heard my name, his tone immediately warmed. I was wondering when you'd call, he said. Your father left everything airtight. They can't contest it. But if they've been living there, we'll need to handle this delicately. Do you want me to start proceedings? I looked around the room, at the familiar bookshelves, the worn leather chair, the old globe my father used to spin when telling me stories of places he'd never visited. I clenched the phone tighter. Yes. Start them. It's time they learned they're nothing more than squatters. When I hung up, I felt a surge of strength, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about property, it was about dignity, legacy, and justice. They wanted to erase me, but I would erase their illusion instead. The following morning, Harold noticed the change in me. Over breakfast, he studied me like a predator trying to make sense of its prey. You've got something up your sleeve, he muttered. I looked him dead in the eye. Maybe I do. Maybe you should be worried. Dinas bristled. You're bluffing. You've always been a coward. I smiled faintly. We'll see. Later that day, as I walked the property, memories flooded me. The oak tree where my mother used to hang laundry, the stone wall my father and I repaired after every storm, the creek where I first learned to fish. Every corner of this land was alive with ghosts of the past, whispering strength into me. I paused at the site where the barn had stood. The contractors had reduced it to rubble, leaving nothing but splinters and dust. I knelt, running my hand through the dirt, silently promising my grandfather that justice was coming. That evening, Harold confronted me in the study. His face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot from whiskey. You think you can scare us with your papers and threats? This house is mine. I've lived here, I've invested in it. I've made it better than you ever could. I stood, meeting him eye to eye. No, Harold, you've desecrated it. You've stripped it for your own greed. You think money and paint can replace history. This house will never be yours, because it knows you don't belong here. His hand twitched like he wanted to strike me, but he held back. If you stay, you'll regret it. I leaned closer, my voice barely above a whisper. No, Harold. If you stay, you'll regret it. The silence between us was electric, thick with the weight of promises neither of us dared to break. Yet, 2 days later, the first official notice arrived. Delivered by courier, stamped with the lawyer's seal, it declared me the rightful owner of the estate. Harold's face turned crimson as he read it, his hands shaking. Denise tried to snatch it from him, her voice shrill as she demanded,
This has to be a mistake!
Tiffany stood in the corner, recording the meltdown with wide eyes, finally realizing the ground beneath them was crumbling. I watched, calm and steady, as Harold crumpled the letter in his fist and hurled it across the room. This isn't over, he roared. I picked up the letter, smoothing the creases with care. You're right, I said softly, almost like a vow. It's only just begun. The tension in the house grew thick enough to choke on. Harold stomped around like a caged animal, barking orders at Denise and Tiffany, as if yelling louder could keep his world from unraveling. Denise spent her days pacing, whispering furiously into her phone to friends in town, spinning tales about how I was the villain trying to rob them of their home. Tiffany, for once, wasn't so smug. She had stopped posting her endless videos, retreating into sullen silence when she thought no one was watching. But I watched. I saw the cracks spreading in their perfect facade. One night, just past midnight, I crept down the hallway and found Harold in the study, hunched over the desk. His face was red, his hands trembling as he rifled through the papers I had locked in the safe. The empty safe door swung wide. He had broken it open. My stomach clenched with fury, but I stayed quiet, leaning against the doorway. Looking for something? I asked. He spun around, guilt flashing across his face before he masked it with rage. You think you can win this with paperwork? You think some dead man's signature makes you better than me? I stepped into the room, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut. I don't need to be better than you, Harold. I just need to be the rightful owner. Which I am. You're nothing more than a squatter, and soon, the law will see it that way too. He slammed his fists against the desk. I built this. I paid for renovations, repairs. You tore down history, I interrupted. You destroyed what my family built, and you dare to call it yours. You're a thief, Harold, nothing more. His breath came in ragged bursts, and for a moment, I thought he might lunge at me. But instead, he laughed, bitter and hollow. You don't have the guts to see this through. You never did. I stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fire in my eyes. Try me. He sneered, brushing past me as he stormed out, muttering curses under his breath. I stood there in the silence, the weight of his words heavy but powerless compared to the determination burning inside me. The next morning, I met with the lawyer in town. We sat in his quiet office, the smell of ink and parchment lingering in the air. He laid out the plan, step by step, showing me how the eviction process would unfold, how every legal angle had been covered by my father's foresight. You're in a strong position, he assured me. They can fight, but they'll lose. The law is clear. As I drove back, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that justice was on my side, sorrow that it had come to this, family tearing itself apart over greed. But as the house came into view, I reminded myself they had started this war, not me. When I walked through the door, Denise was waiting. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. How could you? She hissed. We've lived here for years. We've poured money into this place. You can't just throw us out like dogs. I dropped my keys on the table and met her glare. I'm not throwing anyone out. The law is. And you knew this day was coming the moment you tried to push me aside. Tiffany appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching her phone but not recording. Her voice trembled. Where are we supposed to go? For a moment, a pang of guilt flickered in me. She was young, caught in the middle of her parents' greed. But then I remembered her laughter when they told me I didn't belong, the smug tilt of her head as she mocked me. Sympathy vanished as quickly as it came. That's not my problem, I said coldly. Days passed, each one bringing them closer to the inevitable. Papers were filed, notices delivered. Harold raged louder, Denise wept harder, and Tiffany sulked deeper into her phone. The house felt alive, humming with the storm of their downfall. One evening, as I sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees, Harold came out. His face was tired, lines of desperation carved deep into his skin. For the first time, his voice wasn't laced with venom. It was low, almost pleading. Don't do this, he said. This house, it means everything to us. I turned to him, my voice steady. It meant everything to me first, and you tried to take it from me? Tell me, Harold, why should I show mercy to people who showed me none? He had no answer. His eyes fell, his shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw him not as a rival but as a broken man cornered by his own greed. But pity couldn't stop me. Not now. Revenge was too close, justice too sharp. And when the final notice arrived, stamped and sealed, I held it in my hands like a weapon forged by my father's ghost. The countdown had begun. Their days in this house were numbered, and they knew it. The morning the sheriff arrived, the sky wore a hard, indifferent gray, as if the weather itself would not be swayed by human quarrels. The deputies moved with the quiet professionalism of men who had handled more than one bitter family dispute. Their badges glinted, but their faces were unreadable. Harold met them at the door with that familiar bravado, but it trembled at the edges like a badly mended seam. Denise hovered behind him, clutching a faded shawl like armor. Tiffany lingered at the top of the stairs, eyes rimmed red, phone tucked uselessly into her palm. The deputy cleared his throat and read from a folder, the words precise and mechanical, a writ of possession, court, ordered, enforceable. The paper rustled like dry leaves. Harold's mouth worked. He tried to form a protest, but none of his rehearsed lines held up against an officer's pen and a judge's stamp. For the first time, his posture crumpled in a way I had never seen before. No swagger, no false teeth of confidence. Just the raw, exposed shape of a man who had miscalculated. You have 30 days, the deputy said. You can remove personal belongings. The rest will be handled by the marshal if necessary. Any violence or obstruction and will return with force. Practical, cold, unyielding. Justice dressed in bureaucracy. Denise burst into tears. The kind that make your shoulders shake and your voice thin. She fell into a wooden chair as though the whole house had become too heavy for her to bear. You can't do this, she wailed. Wanid, this is our home. You made it your home by stealing it? I replied, softer than I had intended. My words landed like pebbles in a quiet pond, small ripples that would grow. There was no satisfaction in her tears. I had wanted vindication, not a funeral for what had been a life. Still, I could not undo the past nor the choices that had led us here. Tiffany's face was a study of puerile defiance collapsing into bewilderment. She had no plan, no job to return to, only followers and curated vanity. The realization that virtual fame bought nothing in the muddy, Old-world calculus of eviction seemed to terrify her more than the prospect of leaving the only life she had known. The first week was a scramble. Boxes were packed in a numbing frenzy. Old photographs, my family in faded sepia, were snatched up and tossed into plastic bins like contraband. Harold argued with contractors over what could be sold and what couldn't. Denise negotiated with a moving company, her voice fraying into bargaining for every little thing. They were trying to salvage dignity with material scraps, as if a grandmother's brooch could stitch together a reputation. At night, when the house finally settled and the lights dimmed, I walked its rooms alone. The parlor looked smaller without the barn to the east casting its shadow of history. The fireplace still held the faint scent of my mother's orange peel potpourri. In the upstairs corridor, the wallpaper my father had painstakingly chosen peeled in a corner. Like the lie they'd told about belonging, it wanted to come away. Despite my victory on paper, something in me felt hollow. Revenge had risen like a drumbeat in my chest, relentless and necessary, but now that the cadence had reached its peak, it was quieter and more complex. Justice had been delivered, but at what cost? Family had been fractured beyond easy repair. The house was mine again, yes, but its silence was punctuated by what I'd lost, by the years of estrangement, the smoothed over photographs with my absence like a missing tooth. One night, as autumn loosened its grip and wind threaded through the trees, there was a knock, quiet, hesitant. I opened the door to find Harold standing there wearing a coat that hung off him like a confessional. In his hands was a small box, wrapped in paper and twine. He looked less like an enemy and more like a man reaching for something he couldn't name. "I don't know what to say," he began, and the words were thin with fatigue. "Maybe I'm late. Maybe I'm too proud. I thought if I had this place, I could prove I mattered. That I could prove I was enough." There was an ache in his voice that was not for the house but for himself. His gaze flicked at the doorway, then at the empty porch where the barn had been. He looked older than when I'd last seen him laugh with my mother. Time had carved away his bravado. "What's in the box?" I asked, cautiously. He hesitated, then placed it on the threshold and took a step back as if respecting a line. Inside were two things: a brittle, folded photograph of my father and him, young, sunburnt, arms slung around each other's shoulders, and a brass key on a frayed ribbon. The key was dull with age, the kind you don't use because its purpose is ritual, not function. "My mother kept this," Harold said. His hands shook. "She said it belonged with the family of the house. I thought I could keep it. But we never belonged here the way you did. I was stealing more than wood and boards. I stole time. I'm sorry." For a moment the air between us held the scent of rain, swept earth, and something cleaner: remorse. What he offered was small, but genuine. The photograph showed two men with wide, reckless smiles, the kind born of shared mischief and secrets that bind people together in ways that furniture cannot. It was a fragment of the past I had loved in silence. I wanted to shove the box away, to slam the door on whatever this fragile humility was. Years of resentment had taught me to mistrust handovers that came with two late apologies. Yet standing there, with the house breathing behind me, I felt a version of mercy that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the memory of my parents. "Why now?" I asked. Harold rubbed his palms together, looking suddenly very small. "Because I realized you were right. All my life I thought taking this would make me big. Instead it shrank me. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to have this." He nodded toward the box. I closed the door slowly, taking the photograph and the key. The brass was colder than I expected. The photograph's edges crumbled a little under my thumb. Rage and pity braided together inside me in an uncomfortable, honest knot. "You can stay for a while," I said before I thought better of it. The words surprised us both. "Not because you deserve it, but because there are children in the woods of cruelty who need roofs over their heads until they learn otherwise." I glanced toward the dim shape of Tiffany's room through a half-open door. "And you need to learn how to be a man who doesn't take." Harold exhaled as if I had unstrapped a weight from his shoulders. "Thank you," he whispered, and for that instant the word seemed more genuine than any victory I had achieved in court. The weeks following were awkward and raw. Denise refused to speak to me, Tiffany avoided my gaze like a lover scorned. The house reclaimed itself slowly. The contractors' vans left, the chatter of removal trucks fading into memory. I found myself rebuilding not just boards and beams but rituals. I cooked my father's stew on Sundays. I filled the parlor with the sort of clumsy, restorative laughter that comes when people are trying to be family again. Harold helped sometimes, his hands rusty at first but sincere. I did not become whole overnight. The hollowness remained, a reminder of what had been traded, loved, and then nearly lost. But in the quiet hours, when wind rattled the eaves and the moon painted the fields silver, I would look at the brass key and the photograph and feel something like acceptance unfurl in my chest. And one evening, as winter whispered its first cold edges across the land, I sat at the kitchen table with the deed folded neatly beside my coffee. I thought of my father's voice, of promises made in the warmth of summer and kept in the brittle hours of loss. I realized that winning the house had never been the real victory. The real victory, perhaps, would be whether the people who had nearly broken it could learn humility, and whether I could open my hand enough to let them try. Winter came heavy and silent, wrapping the land in a quilt of frost that muffled sound and slowed time. The house sat solid against the cold, its chimneys puffing smoke into the pale sky, its windows glowing like lanterns against the dark. Inside it felt different now, not just because the deed was safe in my drawer, not just because Harold and his family were counting their last borrowed days, but because something within me had shifted. Revenge had carried me this far, its fire keeping me steady, but as the days shortened and nights stretched long, I found myself staring at the embers of it, wondering what came after. The 30 days were nearly gone. Boxes filled every corner of the house. Denise kept her head low, her sharp tongue dulled by exhaustion. Tiffany no longer posed in mirrors or filmed her empty monologues. She shuffled through the halls like a child who had lost her footing in the world. Harold tried to act useful, fixing loose boards, shoveling snow from the steps, little tasks that looked like penance more than pride. Each act reminded me of the man I remembered from years past. The uncle who once lifted me onto his shoulders at a summer fair, who had laughed so easily when life was still forgiving. On the final evening before they were to leave, I sat in the living room by the fire. The air smelled of wood smoke and faint cedar. The house creaked around me, alive in its old way, and for a long time I sat in silence until footsteps padded behind me. Harold stood in the doorway, his shoulders bent, his face drawn with the lines of someone who had lost not just a battle, but the image of himself he once clung to. "We'll be gone by morning," he said quietly. "You won. I guess you always had." I stared into the fire, watching the logs collapse into glowing ash. "It was never about winning," I murmured. "It was about remembering who this place belongs to. Not just legally, but in spirit." He nodded slowly, then took a hesitant step closer. "I know I ruined things. I tried to build my worth on something that wasn't mine, and it's cost me everything. I can't undo it." His voice cracked. "But maybe someday you'll let me earn back a little piece of what I destroyed." I turned to him, and for the first time in months, I didn't see my enemy. I saw a man stripped bare, hollowed out by his own greed and shame. I thought of my father's words, of my mother's gentle faith in forgiveness, and I felt a weight inside me loosen. "Maybe," I said. "But that's not up to the house or the law. That's up to you." His eyes glistened, and he gave a stiff nod before retreating, leaving me with the fire and the ghosts of memory. Morning came with pale light streaking across the snow. I stood at the porch as they loaded the last of their belongings into a battered truck. Denise avoided my eyes, her face set in stone. Tiffany lingered, staring at the house one last time. Her bravado had crumbled entirely, and for a brief second, she looked like a little girl again, frightened and uncertain. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it and climbed into the truck. Harold was the last to approach. He extended his hand, rough and trembling. I looked at it, then at him, and after a moment's hesitation I took it. His grip was weak but sincere. "Take care of it?" he said. "I will," I replied. The truck rumbled down the long drive, its tires crunching over snow and gravel, until it disappeared beyond the trees. I stood there a long while, the cold biting at my cheeks, until silence reclaimed the land. When I turned back toward the house, I felt something profound, something beyond revenge. This was not just a victory, not just justice delivered. This was survival legacy, a promise kept to the people who had raised me, loved me, and trusted me to protect what mattered. Inside, the house was mine again. Truly mine. Each room breathed easier, as though relieved to shed the weight of false ownership. I walked through it slowly, touching the walls, the banister, the window frames. They seemed to hum with recognition, like an old friend welcoming me home. I ended in the study where the brass key and the old photograph still sat on the desk. I picked them up, holding them in my hand. The key was cold, the photograph fragile, but together they carried the weight of forgiveness, of family, of history too complex to ever fully destroy. As the fire crackled in the hearth, I whispered aloud, to my father, to my mother, maybe even to myself. They said I didn't belong here. But I always did. And now, finally, this house belongs to me again. And with that, the house seemed to sigh in agreement, its timbers groaning softly in the winter air, as if settling into peace after years of turmoil. The story had ended not in bitterness, but in a strange, quiet grace. Revenge had carried me to justice. But it was forgiveness that allowed me to finally feel at home.